I think this is the largest crowd we've ever had, which is wonderful. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Greg Kvistad. I'm provost at the University of Denver, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the second Bridges to the Future event for academic year 2007-2008. I know that some of you were here, many of you were here in October when we hosted Ben Barber, political theorist from the University of Maryland, and he kicked off our series this year on the pursuit of happiness with a discussion of material consumption, citizenship, and individual well-being. If you were not in attendance that evening, we have another option. Ben Barber's talk is now available on the Bridges to the Future website, and I've actually looked at the video clip and it works. The video and the sound match, which is very good. And you may watch that video. The DU Bridges to the Future website is du.edu/bridges. Indeed, tonight marks really the unequivocal entry of the Bridges to the Future program into the realm of 21st century technology. We're actually video streaming this evening, so for those of you who are watching on your computer screens, hello, and thanks for joining us. Also, and this is a new thing, a brand new thing for us this evening, we are inviting you to blog about tonight's presentation beginning tomorrow on the Bridges website that I mentioned just a moment ago. And for those of us who are older than 21, what is a blog? I'll just tell you very, very briefly. According to Google, I looked it up, a blog is a personal diary, a daily pulpit, a collaborative space, a political soapbox, a breaking news outlet, a collection of links, your own private thoughts, memos to the world. It's whatever you want it to be. There are millions of them in all shapes and sizes. New stuff shows up at the top so your visitors can read what's new. They comment on it, send it via email, or not. Blogs have quite literally reshaped communication, especially on the web. And as Google says, we're pretty sure the whole deal is just getting started, quote unquote. So this will be one of the conversation vehicles that we invite you to partake of with Bridges. We've experimented with many different formats, and we thought that this would be a good one to try out for you, our dedicated audience. As I mentioned, this year's theme is the pursuit of happiness. DU faculty and staff, members of the local, and members of the local religious community gathered together last year and decided that this was a worthy topic to explore in this very, very complicated environment that we live in today. I believe you will enjoy this evening's speaker, and I know many of you are familiar with her work. But first, I'd like to say a few words about our discussant. Dr. Roscoe Hill, sitting next to me, has been a member of the University of Denver community faculty since 1973. He's served the DU community in many different roles, in addition to being a professor in the last 35 years, including for 8 years being Dean of the Division of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. I was a faculty member and department chair under Roscoe. He was my dean, and he was wonderful. One reason for that is the reason that he is now one of the most beloved faculty members on campus, as students and faculty at DU have said in so many different ways. So many different times over the years, Roscoe not only knows, but he listens, and he cares deeply. Roscoe received his PhD at the University of Chicago in philosophy department. In the philosophy department, he has taught courses in ancient philosophy, philosophy of law, ethics, and religion. He is currently the director of our social justice living and learning community, and for the past 4 years in November, Roscoe has led the project Dharmsala, which is DU's international service learning program to India. We're grateful to my friend and colleague Roscoe Hill for agreeing to serve as tonight's discussant. Tonight we are very pleased to welcome architect and author Sarah Sasenka. Her build better, not bigger approach is literally redefining the American home and lifestyle. Ms. Susanka's best-selling book series, The Not So Big House, has been featured on Oprah, HGTV, and in publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. I personally spent a little bit too much time on her website this morning scrolling through the not so big home plans for sale. Not that I'm looking to buy a house, but it is so interesting and I highly recommend it. There you can find homes named A Timeless Classic, Playfully Sustainable, One Phase at a Time, Southern Comfort, A Place of Cool Remove. In fact, the last actually describes her website, which I think you should check out if you get a chance. In her latest book, Miss Susanka wrote The Not So Big Life, Making Room for What Really Matters. She explores how we can discover a more meaningful life by weeding out the clutter that so overwhelms us and engaging in the things we really want to do. Sarah Sasenka was born in Kent, England, and moved to Los Angeles with her family when she was 14 years old. She's a member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects and a senior fellow of the Design Futures Council. She runs her online community called notsobig.com out of her home in North Carolina. Now, please help me welcome our speaker this evening, Sarah Sasenka.
Well, I am totally thrilled to be here. I knew Denver liked me, but I didn't know you liked me this much. This is amazing. There are 1,100 respondents, I gather, to the mailing that went out, so that's pretty phenomenal. What I want to do tonight is to address this focus of the pursuit of happiness from a slightly different perspective. Many of you in this audience are aware of the Not So Big House series that Greg just mentioned. Some of you will also be familiar with my Not So Big Life book, and many of you will be wondering, why on earth is an architect writing about life design? And so what I intend to do tonight is to weave the two together so that you can understand what it is about being an architect that allows me to see something about how we're living today that I believe needs a little fine-tuning, just like our houses did 10 years ago and still do today. So I'm going to tell you the story of how I got to be standing on this stage, how I got to become a writer, and how what has happened in the last 10 years has unfolded, and then where it's going from here. Now, all of this sounds as though it's oriented around my life, but what I want you to take away tonight is what this means for you, because I'm living proof that all of us have the capability within us to start moving in a much more sustainable way. And it means something entirely different than I believe we think in our culture today. So I'm going to give you some principles over the course of this discussion just to help you fine-tune your own life and find, first of all, a means to the pursuit of happiness, but more important, to the pursuit of meaningfulness, which I think is really the root that is missing today and what we're really looking for with all of our stuff and all of our purchasing and all of our rushing around. So I'm going to, first of all, give you a little background in where I came from and why I got to be a critic, let us say, of how we build in this culture today. I moved from England in 1971 to a suburb of Los Angeles. So I moved from a village of about 1,000 people to a high school that was 3 times the size of my village. I didn't know there were that many adolescents in the world, let alone that I would go to school with all of them. So it was a really dramatic experience. And one of the things that you'll hear me talk about on several occasions tonight, and one of really the basic principles that's an overarching notion, is that the only way that we can see anything is by contrast. So when we notice something is different than something else, we learn very rapidly. That move from England to this country allowed me to sort of get on a bullet train and start to compare and contrast what I'd known to be normal, both in how people lived in their houses, how we designed houses, but also how we live our lives. And that moment, in 1971, right at that point where, 14 years old, you're switching from being a child to adolescent, everything's changing. Well, my world literally turned inside out. And I began to notice things that are really very obvious, but we don't see them because we're immersed in the culture. So let me just give you an example, which are some of the roots of the Not So Big House series. I noticed when I went to my friends' houses in the US, in Los Angeles, that they had the same rooms that we had in England, but where our dining room was used for breakfast, lunch, and dinner in England, when I went over to my friends' houses, they appeared to eat all of their meals in this funny little booth thing in the kitchen, and the dining room had plastic covers on the chairs. And as far as I could tell, nobody ever sat in them. That was the same for the living room as well. I remember one friend's living room that had furniture that was incredibly decorative, very, very, what for my English eyes was very gaudy. But nobody ever went in there. The only thing that happened was dusting. And I watched this woman dust her house over and over and over again, but it was like it was designed for somebody that was never going to show up. So to me, this seemed really rather obvious that we're missing something in how we're building in this country. It's not obvious when you're just doing what you always do. So over the course of the years, as I continued my education in this country, I started to notice other things that were just odd. Like, for example, my community, the suburb that I lived in, didn't have any shops. To go to the shops, you had to drive, and my mother was quite intimidated by the car that my father had bought her, an Oldsmobile 88, which was a tank. He wanted her to be safe. She wasn't going to get in it to save her life. So we had to walk a lot of places, and we just discovered that that wasn't normal either. Nobody but me was walking to school. It was a strange phenomenon. So we just see that things are, in this country, tend to be larger than they were in my European background, and oftentimes not really very effectively used. So that became the beginnings of my impetus to become an architect. But it didn't actually start with architecture. When I left England, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. And then in moving school systems, discovered that the way that we're taught in this country, where we have mathematics and chemistry and physics all as these separate different courses, in England they were much more meshed, so that I couldn't really fit very easily into the school system. So I discovered that my forte here was much more oriented towards English and writing than it was to the sciences, because I was sort of hard to place into this course structure. So I decided, well, instead of being a doctor, I would be a writer. And I came home one day, I was probably 15, 16 years old, and proudly announced to my mother that I was going to be a writer, and she promptly burst into tears. This was not the right answer, apparently. Well, my father had some advice for me, and he suggested, maybe it would be more sensible to wait until I had something to write about before I declared that I was going to be a writer. And although at the time I was deeply offended by this advice and thought he was really wrong, I now realize it was a very, very wise suggestion. And I started to pursue another thing that fascinated me, which was architecture. I didn't know the name of it at the time. I went to a career day one day at school and started talking to an architect and discovered that they were doing things that I used to do for fun, like draw floor plans. I didn't know that was what architects do. So I started off in this process of looking into a career in architecture. Like so many young people, I got about a year into the course and decided this was not for me. It was so hard. I didn't know what I was doing. There were people that were so much better at it than I was. I was just feeling all this, I can't do this. And again, my father stepped in and said, just hang with it, honey. Just push a little bit further, get over that hump, and you'll be able to do it. And so, even though, again, everything in me was going, I don't know if I can do this, I went towards that thing that I believed I couldn't do. And lo and behold, suddenly it got easier. I knew suddenly how to do it. It's as though, the intuitive senses kick in and you start to be able to do something that you didn't think you could. So what I started to notice was that if I could sort of take a little bit of a step back from what I was experiencing in my life, I could see patterns. I could see that many times, if I just hung in there a little bit longer, I could do something that I didn't think I could do prior to that. Now, I'm going to start overlaying into this architectural story some of what you'll be reading about in the Not So Big Life, because this is where it started. I began to observe myself in my own life. And because I'd had that huge shift from country to country, and because I loved writing, I journaled like crazy. So I have this incredible record of a life as a child, just becoming an adolescent, suddenly noticing these things about her life. All of us do this when we're young, but we forget them because we don't keep all those notes. I'm, probably a little bit obsessive about this. But still, we all have these clues that start showing up in our life to guide us. When I noticed that I was observing patterns in my own life and that I could start learning from them, I got really excited because I began to see that I could become my own compass in a certain way. I could hear my own intuition telling me, okay, I've been in this position before, and if I just keep going a little bit further, I'll be able to keep going, and it will come naturally in just a week or two. So that observer, developing an observer, is one of the first principles of a not-so-big life. Watch your own life. Watch what happens. Notice the patterns, and notice what you learn on each iteration. If you just stop for a second and think about how your life has unfolded over the course of the last few decades, you may see that there are cycles of things. One that I was just describing in the green room a few minutes ago to one of the people that introduced me here was that my life has done these big sort of turnarounds where, for example, moving from England to California. Another one happened when I moved from Oregon after I finished architecture school to Minnesota. Another one happened after the Not So Big House came out when I moved from Minnesota to North Carolina. All these things look from the outside as though they are incredibly tumultuous because there's a lot of things that shift. But when you're riding the wave of that movement, it's perfectly natural. It's not a problem, it's not difficult, it's just what this particular life pattern does. And so as long as I know that I'm okay, which I do because I've done it before, and as long as I stay tuned into what my life is telling me to do next, everything flows perfectly. So not everybody will have one that's as obvious as that, but just pay attention. Start looking at what is it that your life does. And there's a phrase that I use in the Not So Big Life that's an incredibly valuable one, really grows right out of that notion of develop this observer. This is the phrase: if you live your life as a student, thinking of yourself as a student, everything can teach you. And I mean absolutely everything. So you start to put that student hat on, and you start looking at everything for the nutrients that are buried in that particular experience. That's how I started to understand that there was something that I would like at some point to write about related to house design. So let's just keep going for a little bit here and take a look at how things developed from that point. And again, I'm using myself as a guinea pig, but I want you to, as I'm talking, to start translating it into your own life. So I became an architect. I worked in the residential architecture field. And as I began to try to promote architecture, helping people to understand what architecture was all about, I had a great moment of epiphany again. I suddenly realized that an awful lot of people were building house after house after house, thinking each one was going to be their dream home, and then being utterly frustrated with the result. Now, how on earth does that happen? we invest all this money and all our dreams into building a house, and it's not what we want. How does that happen? Well, I started to probe. I started asking my clients, why did they always give me a list of rooms when we started talking? So the first thing out of people's mouths usually is, well, we need a living room, a dining room, and I ask them, well, do you use those rooms? It's like, oh, well, no, but we need them for resale. So I said, we are doing a huge amount of what we do in the built environment in house design because we're building for the next buyer. This is before the house is built. And you don't want those spaces? And I just started to wonder, why are we doing this? So I began asking questions of those clients. And each time somebody would give me this litany of the rooms that they needed, and I asked them the question, well, do you use those rooms? I kept an informal tally. 85% of the people that asked for the formal living room and formal dining room never used the living room. Ever. It was an amazing phenomenon. If they were building a family room, which is what is typical today, that's where most people end up living, the living room should really be called the no living room. And in fact, when I would go to the houses of people who I was going to be doing a remodeling for, that first meeting is always a little awkward. If any of you have had people over to your house, they're about to get to know you extremely well. And so you're evaluating, is this a nice person? And that conversation that's determining whether you're a nice person or not happens in the living room. As soon as they've decided, yep, we like her, they say, well, let's go into the kitchen where we can sit comfortably. So in fact, we are building our living rooms for people we would really rather not have in our houses. Now, I know there are those of you in this audience who are saying, well, I use my living room. This is not a blanket statement. If you use your living room, I'm not trying to talk you out of it. I'm just trying to be that observer of the culture and look at why are we doing what we're doing, just like I'm doing with my own life. Why am I doing what I'm doing? And then how can we do it better? Because ultimately, everybody wants to use the money they have available more effectively. It's a very simple principle. So let's put the money where we use it as opposed to where it's there for people who never come to see it. It's such an obvious realization, and yet it's one that somebody had to articulate. Now, I began to realize just what an enormous issue this was. It wasn't just one or two people. This was most people that came into our office looking for a new house. And indeed, when they were remodeling, what we ended up doing was adding a perfectly good new house to a perfectly good old house. But the old house then never got used because the addition was where they ended up living. So there was something really wrong with this picture. So my practice got more and more successful. We ended up with 45 people, all doing single-family residential design, which is, for those of you who are architects in the audience, you know, a pretty large residential practice. We were doing very, very well, and I was unbelievably busy. And a light bulb went on one day. Here I was finally at that moment that my father had told me I should watch for. I had something I really wanted to write about. But guess what? I had absolutely no time. In fact, when I talked to people, the first words out of my mouth, when you have a conversation and somebody says, "How are you?" It was, "I'm so busy." And I started to notice, this is the observer watching again, saying, "Do you notice how many times you tell people you're too busy? Why is that?" And that particular day when this light bulb went on, I realized that it was me who was creating too busyness. It wasn't something external being done to me. I was the one in control of my schedule. I was the one that was, for some reason, invested in being too busy. And so, right at that moment, I decided I was going to make some shifts to my life. I decided that I was going to designate 2 hours on Tuesday and Thursday mornings to have a meeting with myself. This was how I sort of fit myself into my own life, because the only way I knew how to make time was to have a new client. So I made myself my new client. And it sounds silly, but you kind of have to look at the system you're working within and then sort of be clever with it so that you can convince yourself that there actually is time. That was the way I did it. At the time, though, I was incredibly worried that my partners were going to be very pissed off, that I was going to be making a lot of my existing clients upset. I just didn't really believe that that time was there. But the most amazing thing happened. When I made that commitment, everything shifted to support me. Now, how on earth did that happen? It was as though somebody had thrown a switch, and suddenly the time was there. It wasn't a problem. I even ended up having a new client come who was able to allow me the flexibility to make this Tuesday and Thursday mornings just with myself. I tell a story in the Not So Big Life that just illustrates this point even more. And this sounds unbelievable, and I know there will be skeptics in the audience that will say, no way, but this truly happened. I had decided I wanted to go to a retreat in Washington State, and it was a 6-week-long retreat. And I also knew there was no way this was the same version of the problem. Yes, it was going to be my vacation, but how to take 6 weeks in a life that didn't really allow more than a couple of hours here and there? But again, something inside me just said, I am going to do this. I absolutely want to do this. And there was one particular client who was very picky, and he had asked me from day one to be extremely attentive to him, and I was sort of mustering up my courage to tell him I was planning on going away for 6 weeks. Well, when I got to the office, there was a note on my desk, and it was from him. So I called him right back, and before I could say anything, he told me that he and his wife went to South Dakota for 6 weeks every summer, and he hoped it would be all right, but they were going to be gone. And guess which 6 weeks it was? I am not kidding you. I nearly fell off my chair. And I never had to tell him that I was gone too. I mean, it's astounding when you start to notice these things in your life. We call them synchronicities, and we have a collective, we're sort of teetering on the edge of, do we believe this, do we not? How can that be? It doesn't make sense with our sense of linear time. Well, the way that I put it in the Not So Big Life is that when you are really in tune with how things are unfolding in your own life, you're also in tune with consciousness as a whole. I talk about this as like our collective movie, and each of us is having our own version of that movie. So we're experiencing a personal movie. And when our personal movie and the collective movie are in sync with one another, what results are what we call synchronicities. So there's a way of starting to tune into what's happening in your life, where if you start to see those coincidences happening and you've got multiple choices that you can make, if you just go with the one that's synchronous, you'll start to find that the river just flows more easily. Now, again, I know there are people in the audience going, oh, no, not this. And what I'm trying to help you see is that there's stuff embedded in our world that we can't see. Our senses are limited. And we know that, but yet we don't really buy that there's stuff that we can't see. So I want to give you a demonstration for a second. When you came in, most of you received these cards. And I want you to pull out your card for a second. I'm going to show you, this is a darkened room, so you're not going to be able to do this very actively right now, but I want you to take these home with you. How many of you are familiar with Magic Eye? I'd say that's maybe 10-15% of the audience. Well, this was a technique that you may have seen a number of Magic Eye books. And in those Magic Eye books, there's usually some picture that's buried in this two-dimensional pattern. So this is obviously a two-dimensional piece of paper, a card. But when you look at this, I'll show you how to do it. You can try it now, but when it's dark, it's a little hard to see. Hold it right close to your nose. So you can't focus when you're doing this. Don't worry. Pull it right to your nose, literally touch your nose to the card. And then move it away very slowly. And I mean very slowly. You're not trying to focus. You've just got your eyes soft. And then right about, for me it's right about here. Somebody just got it. I heard you. Right about here, it pops into 3 dimensions. If you can't do this now, take it home with you so that you play with it. These don't have an image buried in them. It's the same image, but it just jumps to 3D. Now, the reason I'm giving you these is that this is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for our lives. Embedded within what we think we know about our world is another dimension. This is 2-dimensional card with 3-dimensional image embedded. What I'm trying to help you see is that within our 3-dimensional world, there's a 4th-dimensional experience that is astounding. And it's where the meaningfulness is that we're all looking for. But until we start to move away some of the garbage that tells us that what you see is what you get, and until we start to learn how to turn off all the mind noise that's constantly worrying about the past or thinking about the future, we can't really feel this. One of the other cool things about these cards is that when you see the image, it's actually very addicting. It releases serotonin, believe it or not. They've done studies of the human body to see why is it that people can't get enough of these images once they start seeing them. And it's just the same with this experience that can happen in your life, which right now I'm going to call it meaningfulness, but there's something that when you feel that feeling, you want more of it. So let's take a little bit more of an investigation into what we might be missing. And I'm going to start talking about why is it that an architect is talking about this. Architects are first and foremost dimensional adepts. That's what we do. We look at 2-dimensional drawings and we can see 3-dimensionally. And so we're very good at moving between dimensions. And in fact, as you get trained as an architect, you learn it even more. People who are attracted to architecture almost always have that kind of skill. Otherwise, they wouldn't be attracted to the field. What I started to notice when I watched all these people building house after house after house and feeling disappointed was another thing that I noticed was that they were picking the house based only on a floor plan. Now, a floor plan is a 2-dimensional abstraction of a 3-dimensional thing. For those that are lost when I say dimension, dimension means length, width, height. And so architects are looking at the length and the width, and they are visualizing the height. But when you're looking at a floor plan, you're looking at something that only has a small amount of the information you need to gauge whether or not this is going to be a place that you really like, which is really a revelation to a lot of people. So I developed a metaphor to help you understand this. If you're not in architecture or design or building, if you look at a map of a city, you don't imagine that you know what that city is going to feel like, right? You know how to get your car from place to place, or if it's a closer up map, you know how to get your feet from place to place. But you don't know what it's going to feel like. For that, you need what architects call elevations, things that show you what the building surfaces are going to look like. And even then, it's a stretch. You really need a 3D model to walk through to imagine. Well, I have news for you. A floor plan is a map. It is a map of your house. It will tell you whether your couch will fit, but it will not tell you what it's going to feel like. For that, you need information about the 3rd dimension, the heights of everything. And so this was one of the pieces of information that I realized I really needed to impart in this book that I wanted to write. Because that, more than anything, if people started to understand the importance of what the surfaces that surrounded them would look like and how that would make their house feel, they would be able to have an experience that gave them an entirely different sense of well-being than when it's just a big barn, where it's just the floor plan that's been extruded up to where it meets the joists of the next level. So it's a whole different thing. And rather than show you pictures tonight, I decided to just describe these ideas. You can look at the Not So Big House series to get a sense of what this means. What does a house look like that's got this third dimension more detailed? I'll give you one other example of a principle in architecture that's very simple. It's a physiological response that we have towards light in this case, and it's something that's tremendously valuable to know because you can make your house feel much more vital, much more animated if you understand it. The principle I name light to walk toward. It's not just a near-death experience. We are literally programmed to move towards light. And architects know this. If you go through any well-designed building, you'll find that there are strategically placed lighted paintings and windows basically guiding you through the building. They're pulling you towards the light. You, until tonight, probably were unaware of it, but that's how we do it. Well, it's such a simple notion. If you've got a hallway, for example, that's deadly, where you just don't want to go down that hallway because it's dull. Instead of that ugly light fixture in the middle of the hallway, put a lighted painting at the far end, or introduce a skylight at the far end that lights the far wall. That's what will draw you down that hallway. So not only does it make the hallway better, but it makes all the rooms that you access from that hallway feel different too, because you feel more engaged in the building. So here's another principle for you, which applies both to house design and to life design. And that is that everything is a reflection. When your house starts to make you feel good, by techniques like what I just described, that carries over into your whole day, every day. And so the experience of living your life starts to improve because your house has shifted. So as you shift your outside world, your inside world shifts. As you shift your inside world, your outside world shifts. And this is where we're starting to see a parallel between Not So Big House and Not So Big Life. Because as you start to do this observation that I'm talking about in your own life, and you start to listen to what your heart longs to do, as I was describing happened for me when I realized I now had something to write about, what happens is that you start to become vastly more engaged in your own life. You start to really show up in each moment. Well, this is the Not So Big Life equivalent of what I was just describing with the Not So Big House. That instead of light to walk toward being a lighted painting, the light that we're walking toward is that joy of engaging what we love to do. When we do that, we are 100% here. We're not worrying, we're not thinking about something else, we are completely engaged in the moment. And that is where this, what I'm calling fourth dimensional experience, starts to come into being. I want you all to just stop for a second and remember, perhaps it was a moment when you went for a walk and suddenly you came across the crest of a hill and there was an amazing view. Maybe it was sometime when you watched a sunset. For a lot of people, these things happen when they're in nature. Just anything that just suddenly stopped you for that moment and you just felt a sense of awe. Everybody got something in their minds? That is what I'm talking about. You were 100% engaged in that moment. And I can feel it right now. I suspect some of you can right now. Because as we're recollecting, we're also collectively here in this moment together. That's where the meaningfulness is. And the fact is, it's here all day, every day, right in front of our noses. Now, again, I know there are those of you that are saying, oh no, Now she's talking about be here now. But it's true. But not the way we think. If you've heard the words be here now and you've said, that's woo-woo, I don't go there, you're missing the vitality of life. It is such a simple, simple notion, and yet it is so awesome when you finally tap into it and recognize this is what I've always wanted. How can that be? How can it be so darn simple? So there's a few techniques that I talk about in the Not So Big Life for how to remember this. Every single person in this room, including me, gets lost in our movie. Our movie does weird things to us, and we end up feeling abandoned and frustrated and angry and all those things. But if you can, in those moments of frustration, ask yourself in that moment, what is now? What am I experiencing right this moment? It's literally like pushing the pause button for just a few seconds. And as you do that, you learn to just let all the noise of daily life calm down, just for a few seconds. And you'll find that it's that internal compass comes back and tells you, oh, I'm lost in my movie. This is not really what's happening. What's happening is I'm seeing some glare for some lights. I'm seeing many, many faces. I know there are a lot more people up here. There's an amazing vitality to this moment. I can feel it. That's what's happening. If I start worrying about what am I going to say next and have I said all my points, and you'll get a very different talk. So this is the point, is that as we are completely engaged in the moment, it's not us that's in charge anymore. There's something that I talk about in the Not So Big Life that's very, very hard for us to swallow at this point in our world and our experience. And that is that we're not in control. We think we're in control, and we think that it's up to us to fix all of our problems and to fix the world. Change the world is our favorite slogan today. But the only place you can change the world is by showing up in your own life and starting to listen to what your intuition is telling you to do. That's where living is happening. When I show PowerPoints, I have this wonderful Mutts cartoon, and they're the two Mutts talking to one another, and one Mutt says to the other, "What time is it?" And the Mutt looks at his watch, and it says now, N-O-W, on it. And he says, "It's now." It's never wrong. It's always now. Now, we can laugh at that, but just, can you hear the truth of that? I mean, this moment is the only moment that there is. Every other moment we can remember is in our memory. Every other moment that we can project into is not there. It doesn't exist. This is it. This is right here. And as we start to engage our life from this point, you can feel it. There's meaningfulness right embedded in it because we are starting to function in a different dimension. Now, that's why an architect is talking about this, because I can see from that observing that I understood how to translate 2 dimensions into 3 dimensions, and I can see how to translate 3 dimensions into 4 dimensions. We can't fully inhabit the 4th dimension yet, but we can have tastes. And as we have those tastes, we realize that all the struggle and all the stuff that we end up getting embroiled in is really imaginary. An awful lot of what happens in our lives is happening because it's happened before, we got into a conditioned pattern, and so we keep repeating what we think we learned as a result of that pattern. So this is again part of that process of observing, understanding that what really Gandhi was talking about when he said, we must be the change we wish to see in the world. We think we understand what he means. And right now, most people are perceiving that there's something out there that needs fixing and we better go do it. But I want to tell you the story of how he came to say that, because it's very informative, just like that looking at the watch and seeing that it's always now. A woman came to Gandhi with her son, who was very overweight. And the woman asked Gandhi to tell her son to stop eating sweets and candy. And Gandhi told her to go away for a couple of weeks and then come back. And she looked confused, but she did what he told her. And so she came back 2 weeks later and asked him, would you now tell my son to stop eating sweets and candy? And he said, yes, madam. And he told the little boy, I want you to stop eating candy. And the woman asked him, well, why didn't you say that 2 weeks ago? And he said, madam, 2 weeks ago, I didn't know if I could stop eating sweets and candy. We must be the change we wish to see in the world. Now, what does he really mean? What he means is that in his movie, Gandhi's movie, understanding that everything is a reflection, the only way that reflection changes all these people in his movie is by him changing his behavior. So he could have said the words 2 weeks earlier. He could have told the woman what she wanted to hear, but it would have had no effect because Gandhi was not able to embody what he was telling. This is so core. It's so misunderstood today. Just think for a second about how much effort we put into changing the world out there. The only place to change the world is to change yourself. Now, that's a profoundly different way of thinking than most of what we engage in today. So as you start watching your day over the next few days, every time you see something that's upsetting to you or frustrating or something that you feel overly concerned about, start to turn it around. Literally, pretend it's a mirror and ask yourself, what is this telling me about me? There's a piece that I describe in The Not So Big Life where the profundity of this really came home. I'd been living through a very frustrating time with one of my colleagues at work, and both of us were distrusting each other, basically. And I wanted so badly for her to trust me. And so I kept bending over backwards to try to find ways to make her trust me. I would give her presents, I would tell her how wonderful she was, all these things. And yet what happened was that she became more and more and more distrusting of me. What I didn't know is that for her, her conditioned pattern was that when somebody is super nice to you, be suspicious. That had never occurred to me because I didn't have that conditioning. I was the nice guy. I wanted everybody to like me, and if somebody didn't like me, that was a big problem. It wasn't until I suddenly realized that I wasn't understanding that I needed to speak honestly in the moment what I was feeling to this person. And as soon as I did, the whole issue went away. It was unbelievable to watch. It was that I had to step up to the plate, do the thing that I most feared, which was actually speak to her honestly. And in that, everything shifted. That's why I call it the movie. Because as you start to see it as a movie, you can start to recognize that this is there for you. Remember I said everything that happens in your life can be seen as a nutrient. If you look with the eyes of a student, everything can teach you. That was the moment I really 100% received that gift. That I needed to learn something. And as soon as I learned it, the world shifted. Now that sounds very different than our linear way of thinking of how things happen. How can this be? How can we all be dreaming these personal movies and it's all exactly perfect for us? How can that possibly be? Well, let's go back to remembering that our senses are limited. We don't completely understand what's going on. If you just look through history, you can see that the science of today was the magic of yesterday. It's always that way, and it always will be. So if we can just open up our aperture just a little to start seeing in a different way, we begin to recognize that there is a lot more nutrient here than we have previously understood. It does require this showing up in your life, though. It does require that you start listening to what your heart is telling you it wants you to do. Now, some of you may have seen in the program that what I was suggesting is that not so big is really the very first step in sustainability. Now, a lot of people understand that in relation to house size, but this is more yet to do with life. Because what we are unaware of is how much our hearts are a part of this planet. We don't think of it that way. We think of each of ourselves as these separate objects. But if you zoom out, I have these wonderful images, you can see them on the website, of looking at, first of all, our Earth in relation to the smaller planets, then our Earth in relation to the larger planets, and Earth is like this, and then Jupiter is this big object. Then Jupiter in relation to the Sun, and on, so that the Sun is just a pixel compared to Antares, one of the largest stars that we know of in the universe. And we think we're in control? You know, this is a massive orchestration. There's no way we understand exactly what's going on. But when we start to loosen the boundaries of what we've believed ourselves to be, just a little bit, we start to see more and more of what we truly have the capacity to be. And it does require what I call inner listening. It requires that we start to pay attention to what our hearts are asking us to do. Because as we do, that is absolutely the most sustainable thing you can do. It doesn't look like it on the surface. When I thought I wanted to write a book, I had no idea that this was the most sustainable thing I could do. But yet, as I actually engaged, and as I started to watch first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of people changing the way they were building their houses to make them better reflections of themselves, a place where they would feel a greater sense of well-being every day, and a place that uses the resources of the planet in such a better way, there was no question. It was really obvious. This was an incredibly sustainable act that I'd just taken. All of us have this capability. We are incredibly creative creatures, and yet we don't realize it because we get all locked into all those conditioned patterns that tell us we can't, we shouldn't, somebody does it better, all those thoughts that go through all of our minds. So how do you get from that little bubble of thoughts that you live in every day to what is really what I call full octane living? It's a step-by-step process, and it requires that you start looking inward. It requires that you start employing some of these things that I'm talking about. And this is just like house design. It's not any different. In the Not So Big Life, I use parallels between house design and life design because we can grasp house design quickly. But life design is exactly the same. And what I'm telling you, if you start to engage it, will give you such a different perspective on what your life is about. You'll feel so much more engaged in every moment of every day, even when it's not good stuff that's happening. I have one phrase that will get a chuckle, and I think I can say this here, but the trick is to understand that the shit that falls on you is fertilizer. Now, I mean, it's simple, and it is 100% accurate. When we stop saying this shouldn't be happening to me, and we start instead experiencing that thing that's happening, just As it is, I went through breast cancer a few years ago. Chemo was miserable. I went from being what I call an Energizer bunny to being extremely lethargic and no energy to do anything. Walking down to the mailbox at the end of my driveway was about as much energy as I had that day. But what an amazing experience. It was absolutely 180 degrees from what I normally experience. And in just experiencing it, rather than judging it as this shouldn't be happening to me, and rather than building on fears of what does this mean for the rest of my life, instead just noticing all the thoughts that came up when I didn't have the energy to sort of override them. I learned more about myself in that year and a half of process than at any other time in my life. That is a gift. That is fertilizer. It's not a bad thing. So again, it's looking in the mirror and seeing it differently. It's just like this. It's just like looking through the storyline of your life and recognizing that beneath the surface is this incredible food. Incredible food. Things always move on. They always change. You always are living the next moment and the next moment and the next moment. Our fear is it's always going to stay the same. It doesn't. That's the nature of this life. Things change. So I hope that as you start to listen to all of these notions of how to think about your life differently, in just the way that I've helped you to think about your house differently, you'll begin to recognize that there's a great deal more potential, no matter how old you are. No matter how old you are, it's always there. And the power of that realization can change your life completely. I want you to just notice that what I did was took one step, making that 2 hours on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Everything else just happened. That was really, honestly, the only moment when I stepped in and said, I feel like I need to make a shift. And even that, in reality, had I just focused my attention on wanting the time, I suspect it would have shown up from what I know now. But that's the simplicity of this. It doesn't require that you figure out every step. It doesn't require that you know the full game plan before you start. In fact, that is 100% impossible. So take that first step. Whatever it is that you've been putting off until you retire or until the grandkids are grown or whatever the issue is in your life, and start. It's an amazingly liberating process. There's one last phrase that I want to leave with you, and it's really something that you could see when I was describing that experience of going through chemo. Life is the experiencing of the experience. It's not anything more than that. If you simply experience what's happening, it doesn't require any more effort than that. You don't have to be figuring out everything that happens next. It will happen. Sometimes people will say, well, if that's true, then why don't I just, sit and do nothing for a week or a month or a year? Try it. We can't. We are physiologically programmed to keep moving, and we will. Life happens. And so as you just allow all the meaning that you're reading into everything to just chill out, just calm down, you discover that there's absolutely nothing wrong. It's just, you just get to experience what's happening right this moment. So it's a powerful understanding. Really, really a different way of looking at things. So the last thing I want to remind you is that I'm nothing different than you are. Truly. I was sitting behind an architect's desk and drawing houses 10 years ago. We all have this most amazing capability. And I've used my life and my houses to explain things about how to do things differently. Whatever your process is, whatever it is that you're here to express through your life will be different. It may take you in very different directions. But by simply engaging it, it will give you the most incredible life experience just by paying attention. And that's what this is really all about. That's why Not So Big is the first and really only necessary step in sustainability. It is so darned simple. The more of us that understand that and start living it, the better our collective movie, this life on this planet, will become. And I know that 100%. Thank you.
Susan, thank you so very much for reminding us that we need to look at ourselves, our lives, not just the space that we live in, for giving us a glimpse of the fourth dimension, and for telling us, whether we believe it or not, that you're just like us. A little bit of housekeeping very quickly. Once we're done with this part of the program, Sarah has generously agreed that she would be happy to sign, autograph any books that you have brought. There are no books for sale here in the building. However, I can assure you that Tattered Cover and Barnes & Noble have, in honor of her visit, shipped in lots of extra copies. And also that the hardcover of Not So Big Life is now in paperback, and you can find that there too.
With a different cover, which is kind of an interesting thing.
Question. Provost Kvistad got lost in the website this morning. A lot of thought has gone into that website, or the two websites,
right,
both the house and the life. Could you talk about that a bit?
Absolutely. Not So Big House, the book, I realized was the seed of an idea. And this came out in 1998, and I was realizing that the web offered me a way to really create a tree of information that people could access to help them make their own homes not so big, whether they were building new or they were remodeling. So I created notsobighouse.com to allow people to find all the links to the best information on energy efficiency, on sustainability, on new urbanism, all the issues that we're dealing with today. And shortly after starting that, I realized that there were huge numbers of people writing to my website saying, where do I find an architect, an interior designer, a builder who knows what you're talking about? And so I began a home professionals directory that is simply a place for homeowners to find the people that they need to make their own houses not so big. It's now actually multinational. It's most completely represented in this country, but there are people all over the world that use that resource to find people to help them make their own houses not so big. So I saw what a powerful tool that was, allowing people to share information with each other about how they were making their own houses not so big. And so when I began the Not So Big Life just a couple years ago, I knew that half the book would be on the web. And in fact, it's an incredibly heavily trafficked website. There's a lot of very useful information there. And it's like an extension of the book. So there are newsletters you can sign up for where I'm actually sending out additional chapters as I find things that people are looking for or trying to understand within the book. There are tools for book clubs, etc., to help you really engage the material. But I think one of the things, if you go to the site, you'll notice is that there's a very high caliber discussion going on. It's not the quick question and answer. It's a much more in-depth probing of a lot of the things that I've been talking about this evening. So the web has, again, this potential to be more than we're using it for. And my desire is to know, how do we use this infinite global brain that we have to its highest functioning? Everything's holographic. I'm trying to do that with how we live in our houses, with how we live our lives, and with how we use the web. So there are all those kinds of notions that are embedded in the websites. And as you start to look, you'll find that there are ways of engaging that you probably had never considered before.
Thanks. In addition to the website, are there book clubs, Not So Big Life?
There's a whole bunch right now. There's people that it started with just the conventional book clubs doing a 1-month session of Not So Big Life, and then I got a whole bunch of emails from people saying, whoa, this is more than we can do in 1 month. And then we had one book club that said they were actually reading it over the course of a year. And now there are actual, more like communities of people that are beginning to engage the book collectively over the course of a year. So there's a lot of activity. It'd be interesting to see how it develops. This book came out in May of last year. And so as people are gradually understanding what it contains, there's a lot more development, things that I had never imagined, that being one of them.
Not So Big House, Not So Big Life. Are there not so big communities?
There's a lot of interesting development happening right now. For the last 10 years, I've occasionally spoken with large-scale builders who are really interested in what Not So Big House and the other 5 books in that series are pointing towards. But just in the last, I'd say, maybe year and a half, I've had many, many inquiries from builders and developers around the country who are looking to create something on the order of a new urbanist community, but with a twist, where the inside of the house, the outside of the house, the street, the way that the streets are laid out in relation to one another, how housing is related to shopping and other community facilities, is all part and parcel of one thing. So I have a feeling that there's probably a movement towards that. I'm currently writing a new introduction and last chapter to the Not So Big House, which is going to be reissued in the fall of this year. And that, I'm just in the midst, I was writing this yesterday, and I said in in that 7th chapter, I wonder if there's a 20-year reissue, if we'll be talking about not so big communities that have been built there. Because right now in this new chapter, I'm able to show houses that people have built over the last 10 years based on the Not So Big House principles. It would be so exciting to see communities happen in the same way. So I think it's coming.
Since I come out of philosophy, I have to ask you a bit more about your sources. Whenever I read what you've written, whether it's about houses and how we use our space, or whether it's about life and how we use our time, it reminds me of Buddhism, the mindfulness teachings that we get from there. Pay attention to the use of your space, your use of time, surroundings, to each moment of every day. And that's what you've been telling us again tonight. What are the sources that you have fed you and led you to where you are?
I'm glad you asked that. I have a very interesting spiritual upbringing. I grew up in a family of agnostics who, in order to rebel, I went to church. And, it wasn't very kindly looked upon. So I characterize myself as having been a very spiritual little kid, but without a direction. I wasn't taught what to believe. And so I've ended up learning from a lot of different sources, and for whatever reason, the teachers, the capital T teachers in my life, have been people who have not a particular denomination. So although I did do some Zen Buddhism early on and studied some Tibetan Buddhism, it's by no means, it's one of like 10 different traditions that I've studied in depth and become a student of. So they're there's a lot of parallels. What's interesting is that if you really drill down to the core of many of the traditions, their highest teachings say very much the same thing. It's, what I try to do, if you look at any of my books, I try to avoid the jargon of the particular profession or whatever it is. So if you look at my books about architecture, I don't use language that's going to lose the audience. And it's the same thing with the Not So Big Life. This book is intended to be a companion to whatever tradition you are a party of. And it can help no matter what you engage. And I think that's really the core. And so I feel as though right now we desperately need to be able to cut across the lines that divide us and find the thing that pulls us together. And it's our own humanity. It's right here. And so as we start to tune into that, then we can share our experience and discover that it's actually not that different from one another.
Are there particular teachers in your life, mentors in your life, people that you have worked with, learned from, or people that you've read that have really influenced
Well,
you?
the easier ones to talk about are the ones that I've read because they're names that are familiar to people. I've had 3 teachers who are invisible, basically. That they're in the world, but they're hidden. They don't publicize. There's that quote. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. It happens, and it's not something you go out and seek. They literally show up, and you suddenly discover, oh, I think I need to be your student, and that has happened for me. But the people who've probably influenced me most greatly in terms of writing. I mentioned several of them in the Not So Big Life. One of them is Normandy Ellis, who is, she's written a couple of books. One's called Awakening Osiris, which is essentially a retranslation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which in fact is the Egyptian Book of Coming Forth by Day, is actually what the Egyptian true translation is. But there are other people. There's A.H. Almas, who some of you may know, who has written an incredible series called The Diamond Heart Approach, which allows you to really start engaging your own inner self. If you like the Not So Big Life, those are excellent. And then there's one book that I love very much. It's got a very simple title. It's called I Am That, and it's by Nisargadatta Maharaj. And that's more truth than you'll see many places.
I don't want to be confrontational, but
Go for it.
with all that you have done, architecture, now as a writer, how do you get off talking about a not so big life?
Well, I do live a not so big life, and it takes discipline to start with anyway, because I think people look at my life now and go, you must be so incredibly busy. Well, for those of you that have read Not So Big Life, you know that that's my nemesis. That's the pattern that I have to keep aware of. So I've built into the system ways of not being too busy, which is sort of like a countervailing approach to my too busyness. And gradually it becomes the natural habit. So when I'm writing a new book, like I am actually right now, I'm writing Not So Big Remodeling, which is coming out in spring of 2008. I know there's a lot of you need that book. I'm sorry, spring of 2009. I keep saying that wrong. And so as I write, I do fewer speaking engagements. Even at its peak, I do only 2 speaking engagements a month. So when I was doing the Not So Big Life book tour, which if any of you have ever seen somebody that's on one of these big publisher book tours, at the end of their 6 weeks, they are just this side of death. I mean, it's unbelievably just unbelievable experience. So I decided to do my book tour in a not so big way. I decided to take the same number of speaking engagements, but to do them over 3 months instead of over 6 weeks. Now, in many ways, that's a dumb thing to do. It will probably never make it to the New York Times bestseller list because what they look at is the number of books sold within that 6 weeks from reporting bookstores. So my 6 weeks had half as many bookstores in it. But the point is that if I'm not doing what Gandhi talked about, if I'm not walking the talk, it's useless. It's not going to have the impact that it does if I'm actually living what I'm talking about. So it actually is a not-so-big life, despite the fact it might look otherwise.
Could you tell us what you're working on next?
Well, I mentioned the remodeling book, which is actually what's taking up most of my time right now. And incidentally, as far as I know, there's nothing like it out there. It's not a book that's got lots of big additions in it. It's more about the small things that you can do to an everyday house to really make it sing. And I know there's a huge need for it. Everywhere I've gone for the last 10 years, people have asked for this. So that's the one that I'm working on right now. I mentioned that the 10th anniversary edition is coming out this fall, and in fact they're going to reissue all of the books with new covers, so I guess that's repackaging. I wasn't in charge of it, but that's okay. And then I think that coming in the future, I want to write a book for teenagers, which I'm calling Living Your Life as the Ultimate Time Machine. And so I think, it's got some of the roots of what we're talking about here, but from that trajectory where you can start to envision your life in a different way than we tend to encourage our youth to do today.
Thank you very, very much. Before you applaud her off the stage, she's not leaving the stage. She's going to stay here. And those of you who have brought books that you would like to have autographed can go up those stairs over there to your right, and then come on backstage.
Roscoe, may I say one other thing?
Yes.
If you do go to either the Not So Big House or Not So Big Life website, you can also order the books from the website, and I'd love it if you would sign up for the newsletter, because you'll get a lot more support material if what I've said this evening is of interest to you. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Sarah and Roscoe this evening. This was really delightful. And I would like to urge all of you to gently push that pause button tomorrow. If 1,000 of us do that for a little while, who knows what will happen. The next Bridges to the Future event will be held in the spring quarter, and our guest will be a professor named Jose Casanova from Georgetown University. And his topic will be Public Religions, the Pursuit of Happiness in Globalization. This event will take place on April 22nd.